At 75, Julie Walters sits in a room where the afternoon light seems too soft to be real, as if the world has agreed to dim itself for her confession. The walls around her hold decades of photographs, film posters, and awards, yet the silence between them feels heavier than the glory they represent. She was once the woman whose laughter could fill a studio, whose warmth could light up an entire film set. But today her voice is lower, slower, like someone carrying a truth that has waited far too long to surface. Time has thinned the noise around her, leaving only the essential: memory, regret, and the sharp clarity that comes with age. She runs a hand across a worn armchair, the fabric soft from years of use, and whispers a sentence that seems to freeze the air in the room. At 75, I can finally admit there are 5 people who broke my trust forever. It isn't anger that shapes her words, but something quieter, something deeper, an ache that has settled into her bones, refusing to leave. The world knows Julie Walters as a legend of British cinema, a woman of humor, resilience, and undeniable brilliance. But behind the applause, behind the bright stage lights, there were shadows that followed her from one decade to the next. She leans back slightly, eyes half closed, as though revisiting corridors of her past where certain faces still linger. Faces that smiled, promised, embraced, then disappeared. Faces that taught her the cost of believing too deeply, trusting too openly. And as the light shifts, drawing a thin gold line across her hands, she exhales a single fragile question, one that seems directed more to herself than to anyone listening. But how did it all begin? This long journey toward not forgiving. The journey begins long before fame, long before the cameras turned toward her. Julie Walters was born in 1950 in the outskirts of Birmingham, in a modest house where the smell of Sunday roast mingled with the faint hum of a radio that never seemed to be completely tuned. Her mother, a deeply practical woman, believed in discipline, in order, in doing what was sensible. Her father, quieter and gentler, spent evenings reading newspapers by a dim lamp, speaking only when necessary. Between them, Julie learned early that silence could mean many things: comfort, tension, or the unspoken worries adults tried to hide. As a child, she carried a peculiar blend of restlessness and sensitivity. She loved to imitate voices, faces, gestures, anything that made people laugh. Yet behind her playful front was a young girl easily bruised by harsh words, easily wounded by disappointment. She remembered sitting on the edge of her bed at age 9, listening to her parents argue downstairs, realizing for the first time that trust could fracture without warning. It was a small moment, almost forgettable, but it left a thin crack inside her. School was no refuge. Though bright and imaginative, she often felt misplaced, caught between wanting to belong and wanting to escape. One teacher told her she talked too much. Another said she dreamed too loudly. Those comments slipped into her like tiny splinters. She didn't know it yet, but they would shape the voice inside her, the one that questioned whether she was enough. Her teenage years were a tug-of-war between obligation and desire. Her mother pushed her toward nursing, believing it a respectable future. Julie tried, she truly did, but hospitals felt cold, too filled with endings and whispered goodbyes. Standing in long white corridors, she felt herself fading. The ache of not listening to one's own heart settled in her chest, dull but persistent. And then one evening, after a particularly draining shift, she stepped outside and breathed the night air as though tasting freedom for the first time. She realized she could no longer live a life chosen by others. The decision was terrifying, but it marked the first moment she chose herself. It was also the moment she learned something essential. Every choice we make leaves someone disappointed, a truth that would follow her for decades. Leaving nursing was not an act of rebellion for Julie Walters. It was an act of survival. The moment she stepped into the world of theater, she felt something awakening inside her, something she had kept dormant for years. The stage was chaotic, unpredictable, alive with the pulse of ambition. But unlike the quiet corridors of the hospital, it did not suffocate her. It invited her. It dared her. It gave her the permission she had been denied since childhood, the permission to feel fully, loudly, unapologetically. Her early years in acting were far from glamorous. She worked long hours, juggling part-time jobs to pay rent in cramped accommodation that always smelled faintly of dust and cheap tea. But when she stepped into rehearsal rooms, the world shifted. Scripts became lifelines, characters became mirrors, and laughter, real, unrestrained laughter, returned to her with a forces she had forgotten she possessed. Directors noticed the sharp intelligence behind her humor, the depth behind her wit, and the vulnerability she tried to hide. Slowly roles came. Slowly she rose. Then everything changed in the late 1970s when she met Victoria Wood, a partnership that would redefine British comedy. The spark between them was instant, effortless, like two fragments of the same thought finally reunited. Together, they crafted sketches that blended warmth, satire, and a raw understanding of ordinary lives. Audiences adored them, critics praised them, and Julie, for the first time, felt seen in a way that nourished rather than drained her. The 1980s brought her to the cinema screen in Educating Rita, a role that would cement her legacy. When the film premiered, the applause seemed unending, the reviews almost unreal. She was nominated for an Academy Award. She traveled, she performed, she spoke on stages she had once only read about. Success, bright and blinding, wrapped itself around her like a second skin. But fame, as she quickly learned, carried shadows. The more she shone, the more people reached for her, some out of admiration, others out of convenience. She felt the pressure to be endlessly charming, endlessly generous, endlessly available. Behind every dazzling premiere was a quieter truth. She was exhausted, stretched thin between what the world wanted and what she could give. Even in her happiest moments, there were small fractures. A comment whispered behind her back, a colleague who smiled on stage and sneered in private, a journalist who twisted her words for a headline. They were small wounds, but they accumulated, tiny stones slipping into her pockets, making each step heavier. By the 2000s, she had become a national treasure. Yet inside, she often felt strangely solitary. The higher she climbed, the more distant the ground beneath her became. The applause grew louder, but so did the echo of her doubts. She did not know it yet, but the people who would break her trust most deeply were already walking into her life, quietly, patiently, like shadows waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Success, however luminous, always casts a shadow, and Julie Walters learned this truth in the most unassuming of moments. It didn't begin with a dramatic betrayal or a headline-grabbing scandal. It began quietly, almost softly, like a crack forming beneath polished marble. One afternoon in the early 1990s, after a long day on set, she overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for her. Two colleagues, laughing lightly, questioned whether her charm was real or just another performance. The words were not sharp, but they landed with unexpected weight. She walked away as though nothing had happened, but something inside her shifted, a small splinter of doubt, too fine to remove. The fractures grew deeper with time. Fame had opened doors, but it had also drawn people whose intentions were less than pure. A trusted collaborator once abandoned a project they had nurtured together, leaving her to face the fallout alone. No explanation, no apology, just silence where loyalty should have been. It wasn't just the professional loss that wounded her, but the realization that she had misread someone she believed she understood. There were personal wounds as well, quieter, more intimate. An old friend from her early theater days distanced herself abruptly, unsettled by Julie's rising prominence. Their conversations became strained, then infrequent, then non-existent. Julie longed to understand what had changed, but every attempt to reconnect was met with evasive warmth, the kind that masked resentment. It was painful, in a way fame could never prepare her for. The loss of a friend feels different when it is not caused by conflict, but by envy. And then came the illness, her own body betraying her. When she was diagnosed with bowel cancer, she felt an unfamiliar kind of fear, one that lived not in the mind but in the marrow. The world suddenly felt fragile. She discovered who truly stood by her, and who vanished the moment the spotlight dimmed. Those absences hurt the most. They taught her that loyalty is loud when life is bright, and silent when darkness falls. Years later, she would look back on this period as the time when trust began to thin, like old fabric stretched too far. Every disappointment, every quiet departure, every broken promise left a mark. And from these marks, the list began to form. 5 names, 5 wounds she could never completely heal. 5 names, 5 wounds, 5 chapters carved into the quiet corners of Julie Walters' life. She does not speak of them with anger. Anger is too loud, too fleeting. What remains is something steadier, a kind of soft ache she has learned to live with, like a familiar shadow that follows her even on the brightest days. Each of these 5 people entered her life with warmth and left with silence, and each departure reshaped her in ways she never expected. The first was a friend from her earliest theater days, a young actor with restless ambition and a laugh that filled every rehearsal room. For years, they were inseparable. They shared cheap meals, opened their hearts about their fears, and dreamed about a future neither dared to imagine alone. But as her career began to rise, his affection thinned. Compliments turned into careful barbs, support into subtle distance. He insisted she had changed, that fame had altered her. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Her success illuminated the insecurities he had long tried to hide. Julie never resented him. What hurt was realizing that some friendships crumble not because of betrayal, but because they are unable to grow alongside you. His silence taught her the first lesson of success. Not everyone is meant to celebrate your victories. The second was a director she had trusted deeply, someone who once spoke to her like a mentor, almost like family. Together, they developed a character meant for her, a role she believed would be one of the defining moments of her career. Their conversations were full of promise, encouragement, and artistic excitement. And then, without warning, he chose someone else. His explanation was brief, impersonal. We needed a younger face. No apology, no acknowledgement of their shared vision. It felt less like a professional setback and more like a quiet dismissal of everything she had poured into the project. The wound was not the lost role. It was the realization that in an industry built on dreams, even trust can be treated as disposable. She learned then that promises in show business often evaporate the moment they become inconvenient. The third wound came from someone bound to her by blood. Family had always been her anchor, the one place she believed love would remain constant. But as her fame grew, so did the distance between them. This family member, once indifferent, became suddenly present, but always with an agenda. Support came wrapped in criticism. Love arrived with conditions. Their words, once dismissive, turned manipulative. Small requests that grew into demands. Affection that felt increasingly transactional. Julie tried to bridge the gap, offering patience, understanding, and forgiveness. But every attempt to heal the bond made the rejection sting deeper. This betrayal cut the deepest, not because it was cruel, but because it came from someone she believed would never see her as anything other than herself. The fourth was not a person, but the media, a collective voice that once adored her. For years, the press celebrated her humor, her sensitivity, her bright presence. She trusted them, believing that sincerity would be reciprocated. But during her illness, when she stepped back from work to survive rather than perform, the narrative shifted. Rumors spread. Headlines speculated coldly about her health and career. Some implied she was unreliable, even difficult. Julie had always given the media her honesty, believing transparency built connection. But they taught her a lesson she never forgot. Vulnerability is cherished only when it makes a good story. Otherwise, it becomes ammunition. The wound was public, visible, sharp. It left her wary of places where she once felt safe. And finally, the fifth person, the one she avoided naming for years, the one who walked beside her in every moment of doubt. It was herself. Julie Walters spent a lifetime giving too much trust, too much forgiveness, too much of her heart. She ignored warning signs, believed in people who had not earned her faith, and pushed herself beyond exhaustion just to meet expectations no one explicitly asked of her. In the quiet of later years, she understands that some wounds were not inflicted by others, but by her refusal to set boundaries. The tenderness she gave so freely sometimes returned to her as pain. Self-forgiveness, she now realizes, is the final and hardest task. 5 names, 5 lessons, 5 echoes that shaped the woman she became. Resilient, scarred, but still unmistakably Julie. Even now at 75, Julie Walters moves through her days with a gentler rhythm, as though each moment is something she chooses to hold rather than rush through. The room around her is quiet, washed in the soft amber glow of late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look touched by memory. On the small table beside her lies a stack of old scripts, a pair of reading glasses, and a photograph from decades ago. 3 reminders of the life she has lived, the people she has loved, and the wounds she still carries with a strange, dignified grace. She no longer seeks answers from the past. Instead, she studies it with a softness that comes only with age, the kind that acknowledges pain without letting it define the entire story. Those 5 faces, once sharp, once haunting, have faded into something quieter, like distant figures on a long road behind her. She remembers them, yes, but she no longer fights them. In this stillness, she admits a truth she has resisted for years. Trust, once broken, does not always need to be repaired. Sometimes it simply becomes part of the landscape of who we are. And forgiveness, so often spoken of as a duty, can also be a choice we are not ready to make. She looks out the window, her breath barely audible, and whispers words meant only for herself. Can we ever truly live without forgiving? Or must some wounds remain so we remember how deeply we once cared?